Well, from the bottom of my heart, a cordial welcome and a wonderful day to all of you who have come. I thank you so much for being present. So you support this conference by your sheer presence. It is utterly important for the conference, also for the questions and answers that will follow, and to give answers to all those questions that have not yet been answered. The topic of our conference is Ukrainian fascism, with a special focus on the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, OUN for short, and the radical wing led by Stepan Bandera, OUNB. You are going to hear this acronym more often before you hear 4 presentations on this topic. I would like to make a few remarks on politics, political culture, and the social climate in Germany and the Western world, to set the mood in order to shed light on the larger context in which the comeback of fascism and the success story of Ukrainian fascism in particular must be viewed. So, as a matter of fact, in the next minutes it will be about the bitter smell of the turn of the tides, the Zeitenwende, the fact that Ukrainian fascism in Ukraine and its international lobby networks receive extensive support and backing from Western democracies cannot be viewed and understood in isolation from the state of late capitalism. Writer Maxim Gorky described fascism as an outgrowth of bourgeois culture which has already passed into rot and decay like a cancer. This process of decay includes anti-civilizational developmental tendencies, which express themselves in the sphere of ideology, in the decomposition of objectivity, formation of myths, fantasies of the end times and annihilation, and generally speaking, in a barbarization of thought. Ukraine is the front line of the global struggle between good and evil. This is a quote. Such positions, which invoke Armageddon as their subtext, and were presented last month in Washington, D.C. by a speaker from the CIA-affiliated Institute for World Politics, echoing Ronald Reagan's evangelical delusions, have been increasingly vociferous, again in recent years among hardliners in U.S. foreign policy. They aim at a course of maximum confrontation that avoids direct military showdown only because of the enemy's nuclear potential. Quote, "My idea of American policy is simple, and some would say too simple. It is, we win and they lose," end of quote, Reagan said in 1977. When he became President of the United States in 1980, he armed counter-revolutionary rebel groups around the world, instigated bloody proxy conflicts, and elevated anti-communism to a categorical imperative. Once again, to this end, he built a vast network of right-wing think tanks such as National Endowment for Democracy or the Heritage Foundation, and both of them play a huge role and forged alliances with fascists, including Nazis and collaborators of Hitler's Germany, for example, Jaroslav Stetsko, successor to Stepan Bandera and chairman of the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations. It was not by chance that Slava Stetsko, his wife and successor, had recommended that the term fascist be replaced by anti-communist. The strategy of imperialist foreign policy of monopoly capital, which relies on alliances with fascists as mobile special squads, stay-behind armies and contract killers, has never been abandoned. Fascists and their highly professional criminal warfare are to the present day, and especially today, among the central enforcement instruments of aggressive regime change policy and NATO expansion aggression in Eastern Europe. The Euromaidan coup and campaign against the restive population in Eastern Ukraine, led by Banderites and neo-Nazis and culminating in a proxy war in 2022, was only a temporary climax. The raiding troops of the US and the West from NATO standard highly armed and radical right-wing militias, which also exercise terror at home against the left-wing opposition and all people who want an end to the war and a peaceful understanding with Russia. How is such a thing possible without a collective outcry from Western civil society? You need to ask. Since the socialist system rival and thus also of the competing world interpretation models disappeared, the provisional victors of history have succeeded in expanding their mass manipulation apparatus of media, culture industry and think tanks in an unhindered and permanently enveloping the population in a dense ideological fog. Since the proclamation of the end of history, neoconservative ideological strategies have been influencing politics, not only of the Republicans and Democrats in the USA, also of the German social democracy, certainly of the Green Party. Neocon think tanks function as the vanguard of sophisticated mass deception. In doing so, they very successfully operate the camouflage of the right-wing NATO agenda with emancipationalist political terms that they have appropriated from progressive social movements and whose meaning they have completely reversed into the opposite ideology. The German red, yellow, green, the traffic light government's talk of feminist foreign policy is nothing more than billboard advertising for a ruthless human rights imperialism with an unrestricted license to kill. Thank you. No wonder its profiteers and functional elites have great plans. Quote, the victory must be complete. End of quote. The above-mentioned speaker of the Institute for World Politics blatantly unfolded their goal and explicitly counted the complete elimination of communism among them. A vision that has always united the fascist international is its most urgent historical mission and repeatedly drives it to completion. Finally, so the reasoning of the speaker, I quote, good cannot compromise with evil, end of quote. Again, landing with the irrational delusions. In Washington, a new phalanx for the fight against communism is currently being formed by the so-called Victims of Communism Foundation. With the Bandera lobby, you would not expect anything. But interestingly, also the former German president, Joachim Gauck, as a figurehead. The reawakened German Drang nach Osten, the drive to the east, produces factual constraints. The German government has also opened its doors to Ukrainian fascists. In the spring of 2023, its particularly value-oriented foreign ministry received a delegation from the neo-Nazi movement Azov about a month before its army brigade celebrated the 80th anniversary of the Waffen-SS division Galicia. Accordingly, it reacted to a minor inquiry by the member of the Bundestag of the party Die Linke, Stepan Bandera, about right-wing extremist manifestations of Ukrainian historical politics with silence, ignorance, and outrageous protective claims about the old and new allies of German imperialism, the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, whose fighters had participated not least in the German Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, participating in the Holocaust and in the war of extermination against the Soviet Union. In the country that prides itself on an exemplary coming to terms with its past, it is apparently also possible to rehabilitate the perpetrators. There is no longer an effective opposition that would raise any objections. The minor inquiry by Bundestag member Dadelin remained a lonely initiative. The parliamentary group of her party, ex-party, Dadelin left last Monday Die Linke is increasingly practicing the German raison d'être of NATO imperialism, and so far has not shown any significant effort to fight pro-Western fascism. The same is true of the trade union establishment and, most tragically, most of the anti-fascist movement in Germany. Germany, as already envisaged in the Brzezinski strategic plan, is once again becoming the leading military power in Europe, with the delivery of armaments soon to be worth 18 billion euros to the Ukrainian army, and thus also to its fascist units. Germany stands right next to the USA on the commander's mount of the West's proxy war against Russia, perhaps one day also against China. The preconditions include a stable home front and a quiet hinterland. For this, a people's community is being built for a false peace between the huts and palaces. This cannot be done without the participation of social chauvinist forces, a decay product of the left, largely uprooted from historical materialism since 1989-90, who divide, denounce, slander and drown every humane stirring in the moral acid brewed in the laboratories of the NATO neocon think tanks. After all, their mission is to nip a popular front against war and fascism in the bud. Therefore, it is only consistent that social chauvinist leftists ideologically flank the further escalation of the Ukraine war, as well as the merciless bombardment of the civilian population in Gaza, with the heteronomous instrumentalization of the world historical imperative after Auschwitz. There is nothing that can be used more impressively to legitimize the next time than the slogan, "Never again." And so, a completely disoriented left forms, at least objectively, the escort for the unhindered execution of the famous Zeitenwende, the turn of the times, proclaimed by the German government on February 27th. 2022, which marks the preliminary climax and probably also the final phase of the successful German normalization. Poet Erich Fried called this Wiederschlechtmachung, repeating bad things with worse things, because it is linked to the removal of taboos about fascism. Elements of fascist aesthetics and ideology, militarism, blood and soil folklore, archaic heroic myths, homage to death and destruction have long been condensed in the culture industry, accelerated by the Azov and other Ukrainian Nazi cults and their aggressive marketing, which we are seeing today in the German media. The fact that a cultural senator from the left party, of all parties, has provided funding for a Bandera musical in the German capital is a deeply ironic yet particularly bad joke in the recent history of the Berlin Republic. On the political level, it is evident how far advanced the restoration of German imperialism to a state of permanent violence already is. For example, in the thuggish treatment of declared enemies, the hate campaigns against Russians and Palestinians, the harassment up to the application of the law of the enemy against peace marches, alleged Putin and Hamas understanders, including the Jewish left, indicate they are also being attacked. All this indicates that the ruling class does no longer attach any practical value to bourgeois democracy. Inevitably, Zeitenwende, the turn of the time, means the revision of the previous exercise of coming to terms with the German past, not only through denial and trivialization of German crimes. It also happens by trivialization and inflation with the aim of relativization and protection of barbarism once committed by the Germans onto the damned of this earth. Those who today, as it happens on all propaganda channels, rant about extermination, anti-Semitism and breach of civilization of the Palestinians, even Holocaust in Israel, and German responsibility in order to prevent a humanitarian ceasefire, will tomorrow use Gaza as a final dump for German guilt. And the day after tomorrow, and that's the final purpose, in order to applaud the deployment of German troops against Iran, Syria and Russia the day after tomorrow. As a precaution, Ukrainian nationalists have already identified Hamas as the tool of the greatest of all demons. Quote, the hands that drive these killers are in Moscow, end of quote, was recently posted on the social media channel of a facade structure of the Bandera wing of the OUN. The Fascist International has long been at the forefront of a major offensive for historical distortion, disinformation and myth-making. Thus, hand in hand with Ukrainian Nazis and other nationalists throughout the Western world, the propagation of the Holodomor narrative is also being carried out at full speed. This is nothing else than an attempt to retroactively pin genocide on the Soviet Union, which was invaded by Hitler's Germany. In the thoroughly ideologized historical discourse in the USA, people have long been talking about the double Holocaust. Political scientist Andreas Umland, who has worked, among others, for the Federal Agency for Civic Education, which is under the Federal Ministry of the Interior, and the Green-affiliated Heinrich Böll Foundation, among others, commented on our event by saying, quote, since this is a left-wing Bandera conference in Germany, it will be mostly about Bandera's imprisonment in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, the death of 2 of Bandera's brothers in Auschwitz, the persecution of OUNB members by German occupation forces in Ukraine, and the like. Right? End of quote. It is hardly possible, ladies and gentlemen, to push the victimization of Nazi collaborators and thus their rehabilitation in a more cynical and perverse way, namely by omitting decisive historical facts. This historical distortion corresponds with an outrageous statement made by Annalena Baerbock a few months before she took office as foreign minister, in which she praised her grandfather's service as a soldier in Hitler's Wehrmacht in the final battle against the advancing Red Army in 1945 as a valuable contribution to a united Europe. She was, historically, and I quote, not only standing on the shoulders of Green Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer, who had justified, just by, to remember, Germany's participation in the war of aggression against Yugoslavia in 1999, which violated international, she said, not only on the shoulders of Joschka Fischer, but also on the shoulders of her grandparents, Baerbock casually stated in an interview with the US-based think tank Atlantic Council. By the way, now a key interface between the Bandera lobby and the US government. And I quote her, and that's the ground I stand on. End of quote. She said so. This political positioning can certainly be understood as a pre-conscious commitment. What Marxist artist Lea Grundig once stated about fascism and its potential for manipulation also applies to the bourgeois Democrats who trivialize and deny him and defish him in order to bring him back into position today in the imperialist war. Quote, according to plan, their propaganda works to extinguish the light of thought. While they generally dehumanize others, they use stupidity as their preferred weapon. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, not for these reasons, but also for these reasons, I wish you a conference day illuminated by the shining light of reason and hope. Thank you very much.